There are 5 important version control systems that predate Git that I want us to look at. There have been many others over the years, but these are some of the most popular and the most influential. The first of these is SCCS. It wasn't the first, but it was the first to become popular. It was released in 1972 and was developed by AT&T and bundled free with Unix. Now, Unix was also free, and as a consequence, it spread quickly to places like universities. So, therefore, universities also taught their students how to do version control using SCCS. So if you were writing Unix programs, that's what you learned to use. And then when these students left the universities to go work in jobs, the version control system that they were familiar with and they took with them was SCCS. So you can see why it became very popular. And we talked about very primitive version control earlier, that you might have something like a budget, and you might save version 1 of the budget and version 2 and version 3, just giving it a different file name each time. Well, when you do that, you're actually saving the full document 3 different times. That's not the most efficient way to do it. What SCCS does is it keeps the original document, but then instead of saving the whole document a second time, it just saves a snapshot of what the changes were. So if you want version 5 of the document, you just take version 1 and apply 4 sets of changes to it to get to version 5. It's a much more efficient way to store the changes over time. So SCCS stayed dominant until the early 80s when RCS was developed, Revision Control System, and it just made lots of improvements over SCCS. For one thing, it was cross-platform, whereas SCCS was Unix only. With the rise of the personal computer, it was important to have a version control system that could work on PCs. It was also more intuitive, had a cleaner syntax with fewer commands, but more features. And most importantly, it was faster. And a lot of its speed increase came from the fact that it used a smarter storage format. Whereas SCCS stored the original file and then kept track of all the changes that went after it, RCS flipped that around so that it kept the most recent file in its whole form, and if you wanted previous versions, then you applied the change snapshots to go backwards in time. If you think about it, that's a lot faster because most of the time what we want to work with is the current document. With SCCS, if we wanted the current document and there were 20 sets of changes, we had to pull up the original and then apply 20 sets of changes to get there. With RCS, we could just bring up the original file and it's already stored in its full state. Now, one of the problems with both SCCS and RCS was they only allowed you to work with an individual file one at a time. So you could track changes in a single file, but not in sets of files or in a whole project. CVS allowed you to do that. That's for Concurrent Versions System. Now, the real innovation, though, to CVS is not just the fact that you can work with multiple files. It's the concurrent part, the fact that we can have a place where we store our code called a code repository. We can put that on a remote server, and more than one user can work on the same file at the same time. They can work concurrently. With previous versions, only one person could work with a file at a single time. So CVS adds a lot of features for users to be able to share their work and be able to update their file with changes that other people have made and placed in the remote repository. This idea of working with remote repositories was further improved upon with Apache Subversion, or SVN for short. SVN was faster than CVS, and it allowed saving of non-text files like images, whereas CVS couldn't do that. But most importantly, the big innovation for SVN was that it was tracking not just changes to files or to groups of files, but actually watching what happened in a directory as a whole. Watching the files in the directory and actually taking a snapshot of the directory, not just the files. Now, that may seem like a small difference, but it's important. In CVS, you would talk about having revision 7 of some file. In SVN, you would talk about some file as it appears in revision 7. SVN could track the history of directories. For example, CVS had a hard time if you renamed a file. SVN, though, would track that change with no problem. If you add a file directory, remove a file, rename it, it's watching the directory as a whole to see what happens and taking a snapshot of that, whereas CVS was just looking at a collection of individually named files. CVS would also update files one at a time as it went to either apply or read back changes. SVN would instead do a transactional commit and apply all of the changes that happened to the directory or none of them at all. The snapshot was bigger than just the individual files. It was the entire directory, the entire set of changes that were happening to that directory at one time. It's a subtle but important difference. Now, SVN stayed the most popular version control system for a very long time, until Git came out. But there's one other version control system that I want us to look at before that, and that is BitKeeper, SCM. It was a closed source, proprietary source code management tool. That means that a company owned it and sold it, the same way that Adobe sells Photoshop or Microsoft sells Word. one of the important features that BitKeeper had, and it wasn't the first to have it, but is distributed version control. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of being closed source, whereas all the other ones that we've been looking at for a while had been open source. The community version of BitKeeper was free. It had a few less features and some usage restrictions, but there was a version that they gave away for free. And that version was used for source code management of the Linux kernel from 2002 to 2005. Now, it was controversial to use a proprietary SCM for the Linux kernel because the Linux kernel is an open source project. No one owns it, whereas the SCM is owned and controlled by a company. So a lot of people objected, saying, well, what if they change the rules in the future? Suddenly we're going to be screwed because we're stuck using this company's software. Well, guess what? In April 2005, the community version stopped being free, and all those predictions came true. Now, BitKeeper was never as popular as CVS or SVN, but it is super important to the creation of Git because of its connection to Linux. Because in April 2005, when the community version stopped being free, that's the same point at which Git was born. Git was created by Linus Torvalds, and you may recognize that name as the person who created Linux and still drives the development of the Linux kernel. When BitKeeper stopped being free, they needed an alternative for managing their source code. Linus looked around and didn't like the other VCSs that were out there, like CVS and SVN. He did like some of the concepts of BitKeeper, but he thought he could do even better. So he wrote a new VCS from scratch. Now, Git is distributed version control, like BitKeeper, and we'll talk more about distributed version control in the next movie. It's also open source and free, which is great for us because it means that people like you and me can download it for free and use it for free with no license fees or anything like that. It also means that because it's open source, the community can see the source code and contribute to it as well. So they can submit bug fixes, add new features, all of those things we get to be the beneficiaries of because it's an open source project. It's also compatible with most platforms, Unix-like systems, and Windows, and it's faster than most other source code management tools, 100 times faster in some cases for some operations. And it has better safeguards built into it to guard against data corruption. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, these improvements worked. Git became a hit as people discovered the power of distributed version control. As they got used to all of Git's nice features, Git has experienced an explosion in popularity. Now, there's no official statistics on this, but to give you an example, GitHub launched in 2008 to host Git source code repositories. In 2009, there were over 50,000 repositories with 100,000 users. In 2011, just 2 years later, there were 2 million repositories with over 1 million users. So you can see this rapid growth in just 2 years. So Git has definitely taken off. In the next movie, let's talk about distributed version control and see why that's such an important feature